Good morning. Oh, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ron McClain, Executive Director of the Institute of Mental Hygiene and Public Policy Committee Chair for the United Way of Southeast Louisiana. Really happy you're here today, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for what's going to be a very, very important topic area. And we're really proud to hear from our experts. And so stay tuned. So why are we hosting these sessions anyway? Every year, United Way of Southeast Louisiana creates an agenda outlining our public policy priorities in health, education, financial stability, and community strengthening for the legislative session. United Way's legislative agenda advances our fight to eradicate poverty in Southeast Louisiana through the Blueprint for Prosperity and by supporting ALICE families, those families who are asset limited, income constrained, but employed. We focus strongly on public policy because it's one of the most effective ways to drive the systems level change our community needs. These educational sessions allow our public policy committee to gain insight from experts on key public policy issues and develop a comprehensive agenda. We also collect information on the legislative priorities of United Way's community partners, those agencies and organizations out there providing critical services on the ground to citizens in our seven parish region. Now I'd like to welcome today's speakers. As you know, we'll have Mariah Wineski with the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence, Kim Sport with United Way of Southeast Louisiana, Morgan Lamandre with STAR, and Dr. Dana Hunter with the Governor's Office on Human Trafficking Prevention. Now I introduce our leader, President and CEO of United Way of Southeast Louisiana, Michael Williamson, who will have a discussion on ALICE households.
All right, well, thank you, Ron, and I want to not only welcome our panelists, and I'm excited to along with our attendees, learn from you as well. And Ron, I think teed up very well the importance of our policy, our public policy and advocacy work. Let me talk just a minute about for who and why. Some of you may know ALICE. ALICE in our world is an acronym. This stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Yet Employed. And we all know ALICE. They may be a relative or a friend. They are often cashiers, waiters, childcare workers, and other members of our essential workforce. They earn slightly above the federal poverty level, but less than what it costs to make ends meet. Now, these struggling households are forced to make impossible choices every day, and while such hardship is pervasive, households of color are disproportionately represented as ALICE. ALICE also represents the data reshaping the dialogue on financial hardship and a grassroots movement that is picking up steam across the United States, half of the United States and counting. There are better than half of the states in our nation that are currently ALICE report states. But let me just dive in for just a second about ALICE in Louisiana. And what we've seen is over time, 3 different trends have been increasing. First, the cost of living increased more for ALICE households than the overall inflation as measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Price Index. And we also noted that worker vulnerability increased with growth in low-wage jobs and more fluctuations in hours, schedules, and benefits, while wages remain stagnant. And the number of ALICE households increased also. And while there has been a spotlight on poverty, which has remained flat and is anticipated to drop some in the wake of pandemic aid, the number of ALICE households, the working poor, we might, as we qualify them, has continued to increase, rising from 22% in 2007 to 33% in 2018, and we expect those numbers to grow. And we anticipate the number of ALICE households will increase in the next report release. Let me talk just a moment about that. Unemployment, closed businesses, and halted production of many goods and services reduced the income of many of our ALICE households. The 12% of households on the cusp of the ALICE threshold in 2018 remain especially vulnerable during these times. And the number of ALICE households unable to afford the basic household essentials has already been growing over time, noting that the percentage of ALICE households below the ALICE threshold increased from 41% in 2007 to 51% in 2018. Now, how does Louisiana compare to the rest of the nation? Louisiana has actually led the nation in 2018 with 51% of households living below the ALICE threshold. That means more than 1 in 2 households are struggling day to day and are unable to afford their basics. Specifically here in Southeast Louisiana in 2018, 15% of Southeast Louisiana's households had income below the ALICE threshold, meaning they were unable to afford even the most basic budget. And a large number of households struggling before COVID-19, the COVID-19 crisis helps explain why the dual impact of this health crisis and economic disruption is so severe. You'll hear from a minute from Mary Ambrose, but let's talk just a second about equity for ALICE. And it's important to note that creating equity for ALICE means illustrating how barriers by race, ethnicity, age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, zip code, health, ability, veteran status, and/or immigration status limits life outcomes, and working to remove those barriers so that all people can participate fully in all aspects of our social and economic systems is the work we're doing at United Way with many of our partners. Through this series of educational sessions, we strive to recognize and document the role of structural inequities in the lives of ALICE families by, one, using the best possible data to show where opportunity is and is not available, where it is easiest to fall into hardship, and what structural changes are needed to make ALICE individuals, households, and communities safer and more secure. We also believe it's important to hold ourselves accountable to taking an equity-centered approach in our work and call to attention any actions that run counter to those efforts, and being intentionally inclusive and widening the diversity of the network of collaborators on our committees without overburdening any individuals or specific groups. And the point of today, advocating for ALICE by providing research and data to inform strategies and solutions to assist those who are struggling financially to make ends meet, and by shining a light on racist and discriminatory systems and policies in order to affect real change throughout our region. All this with the ultimate goal of making sure all ALICE households have everything they need to live and thrive in this new and more modern economy. So that's just a brief on ALICE. I know many of you know ALICE, but I hope many of our attendees may have learned a little more about the struggles facing ALICE households. And now it's my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce our new Chief Equity and Impact Officer, Ms. Mary Ambrose.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Michael, and thanks, Ron and Charmaine, for centering these conversations in equity. And so I want to start us off with an equity question, and this is to the panelists. So often policies are created without community input, causing harm, especially to the same communities that they are intended to help. How are you ensuring you are putting people first, focusing on real people's problems and experiences to uncover and address systemic inequities? So I'm asking this of the panelists, but if others have thoughts, please put them in the chat. And whoever wants to start first.
Sure, I'm happy to address that. I'm Mariah Wineski with the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. And I think at LCADV, that's something that comes very naturally to us. So every piece of our work at the coalition is really informed by and led by survivors of domestic violence. We're an organization that really kind of grew from the ground up. So our entire structure, the way that we're structured, is really built to maximize the input from the survivors that we're serving. So survivors comprise a lot of the leadership of our member programs. They comprise a lot of our board of directors. They comprise our caucuses and our work groups that inform all of our initiatives. So there's really not a thing that we do at LCADV that is not really driven by survivors, being the driving force behind it. And I think when it comes to domestic violence in particular, that's an area that a lot of people misunderstand and have a tendency to oversimplify. So because of that, it can be really easy to have to propose policies that sound really good and might be really well intentioned, but end up backfiring and really harming survivors in the end. So we see this a lot, for example, with policies that rely entirely on criminal justice responses. So in addition to seeking that input on the front end before supporting or bringing a legislative proposal, we also like to actively monitor the impact that prior years' proposals have had. So, we might have listening sessions or formal or informal feedback mechanisms with survivors, and just having those ongoing conversations with survivors that really lead our organization and our efforts to see, do we need to go back and address something or fix something? Is it not working the way it intended? Tell us what you're seeing.
Great. Thank you, Mariah. Anyone else wants to go?
Sure, I can hop in and just piggyback off of Mariah. So likewise, with the Office of Human Trafficking Prevention, we kind of framed our office around the motto of nothing about us without us, or nothing about them without them. And so we created a Survivor Advisory Council, and we compensate our survivors at a consultant rate equivalent to that of an expert. And so we let them know we're not just bringing you to the table, but we really value your knowledge, your experience, your lived experiences, and your expertise. And so we include them also in our Human Trafficking Prevention Commission and Advisory Board. They're at the table when we're talking about policy and legislative recommendations. They're vetting our thoughts, they're adding thoughts, they're leading and guiding the conversation. And so we don't wait until we get to the end. We don't wait till we're in session and on the floor to think about challenges or unintended consequences. We vet that out with our survivor leaders up front. And that has been paramount and instrumental in the progress that we've made here in the state.
Awesome. Mariah and Dr. Dana Hunter, I'm just loving this, because we're not just extracting from those communities, we're giving back and we're supporting them. Morgan and Kim, would you like to answer?
Kim has her hand. And Kim, you're on mute. Thank you.
I think most of you know that my involvement in domestic abuse, which I like to call it, because I think domestic violence is a physical manifestation of domestic abuse, has been in the legislative area. And I will tell you that as far as meeting the needs of everyone in the community, it's been at the forefront. It's definitely been at the forefront of our work. There are no laws that are passed that benefit one citizen more than another. There's no penalty that's imposed upon an abuser that's less or more harsh, depending on your socioeconomic status. It has been everything in our power to pass laws which try to help victims who may not have the resources to help themselves in the most positive way possible. And that's been through the granting of an immediate divorce, if you get a protective order, or if you can prove that you're a victim of domestic abuse. It has been in the area of spousal support, so that if you can prove that you are a victim of domestic abuse, your spousal support can exceed the normal statutory limits. It's been in making sure that firearms are taken away from abusers, providing protections in courtrooms during domestic violence proceedings, and on and on and on. Also making it easier for victims to be able to have themselves or their attorneys go to their local sheriff's offices and obtain a background check on their alleged abuser. That was never done before. And then also other things like making sure in any case involving domestic abuse, whether it's criminal or civil, that you can introduce evidence of past acts of abuse as an exception to existing evidence laws. So I think that we've been able to do a lot of things. There's a lot more that needs to be done. I'll get into that later. But to answer your question, I also want to bring out, Mary, that domestic abuse affects every home. While yes, it definitely can be more prevalent and usually is in the Alice households, we have to understand that what is it, one in eight, Mariah, 1 in 8 women, no matter who they are going to be a victim of domestic abuse. And the hardships that are imposed in these situations, the financial hardships, are sometimes even worse for victims who are not in the Alice category, because their abusers have such manipulative means of blocking access to bank accounts and things of that. They can really, really put them through the ringer if they're trying to get a divorce or to separate from their abusers.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for pointing all that out for us. Morgan, would you like to go? And then I think Ron will close it out with Morgan.
Okay.
So I want to piggyback off of what everyone else said, but also to say that, you know, we definitely put survivors' voices at the forefront of all the policy initiatives we pursue. But one of the things that we know at STAR is that we can always and must do better about what survivors can actually reach us. So to even be able to access STAR services, there are certain privileges you must have. And we know that, you know, there are other organizations that, because they're more embedded into certain communities, have more reach, have more touch. And obviously we're always looking at ways to ensure that more survivors from all backgrounds, races, socioeconomic classes can reach STAR. We know that we always need to do better. So we specifically reach out to communities we know are definitely seeing more survivors from all those backgrounds. So everything everyone else said, but also we reach out to organizations as well.
Well, thanks so much to the panelists for responding to this very important question about involving people with lived experience and solution focused and finding solutions to systemic problems. So thanks so much for responding to that. Now I'll transition into introducing our wonderful experts again to talk more specifically about the work they're doing within their own circles, and obviously work that impacts a lot of people. First, we have Mariah Wineski. Mariah is the Executive Director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Domestic Violence. She's the current chair of the Louisiana Domestic Violence Prevention Commission and previously served on the board of directors of Boulder Sister Cities. She has also served on the Victim Services Advisory Board of the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement, the membership committee of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and the advisory board of the Louisiana Violent Debt Reporting System. Without further ado, Mariah Wineski.
Thank you, Ron. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So my name is Mariah Wineski, and I'm really honored to be able to be here, share information with all of you today about LCADV and our advocacy initiatives to promote safety for survivors of domestic violence. So a little bit about us, just briefly. We are the federally designated statewide network of domestic violence shelters and advocacy organizations all across Louisiana. We've been around for about 40 years, and in that time, we have seen immense change in our state's legal responses to domestic violence. 40 years ago, obviously, survivors had no access to protection orders. We had no remedies for housing discrimination. We certainly had no access to immediate divorce or anything of that nature. But as we have seen, many things can happen when survivors and advocates come together and organize and work for change. So our role is to provide that unified voice for Louisiana's anti-domestic violence movement. And we do that by centering survivors in every aspect of our work, being survivor informed and survivor led. And from there, we engage with partners and stakeholders to build and sustain that really robust movement to end domestic abuse in all of its forms. So, hold on, sorry, I had something. Here we go. Okay. So the federal government has established that there is one federally designated statewide domestic violence coalition in every state in the United States and in every territory as well. And coalitions do really specific work that is meant to complement and enhance and build the capacity of direct service organizations. And so that work, of course, includes legislative advocacy, but it also includes training for law enforcement and advocates and attorneys and healthcare providers and many more professionals who kind of play a role in our systemic responses to domestic violence. And it also includes building the capacity of the local domestic violence shelters and advocacy programs. So we provide resources to help them do the very best work that they can do in their local communities. And it also includes public education and social change. So our overall goal, we work in many different arenas to create a world where domestic violence is no longer tolerated and to address the social conditions that allow violence to occur in the first place. So we're a collective of organizations and programs and individuals across Louisiana who are working to end domestic violence in lots of different ways. And our membership consists of those direct service organizations, and they provide that 24-hour confidential support directly to survivors of domestic violence. And that support can take lots of different forms, from crisis hotlines to emergency shelter, legal advocacy and legal representation in some cases, prevention education, housing support, and lots of more services. So unfortunately, Louisiana has a domestic violence problem that is really severe and often deadly in our state. So this graph represents Louisiana's rate of women murdered by men over time by each year since 2011. And as you can see, we are significantly and consistently much higher than the national average. So we're the green line and the national average is the blue line there. So in fact, we have ranked in the top 5 in this really grim statistic almost every year for the past 22 years. And anytime that we talk about this, we're often asked why. What is it that sets Louisiana apart from other states in this way? Now, I love Louisiana. I am raising my 4 kids in Louisiana. I am never leaving Louisiana. And so I refuse to believe that we are inherently more violent than other states, right? But we do have a lot of systemic issues that other states have already successfully addressed, and Louisiana has not. And these systemic failures, unfortunately, are resulting in the deaths of many Louisiana citizens that could have been prevented. So there are a lot of factors that kind of contribute to these really high homicide rates. There are gaps in accountability. There are practices that kind of prioritize law enforcement or court convenience over survivor safety. But one of the most glaring and obvious failures in our state is the complete lack of investment in basic safety services for victims. So as advocates and folks who are working directly with survivors, we have known for many, many years that the resources that are available to do that work are not sufficient to meet the very vast need with which we are faced. However, in 2021, this was validated by the Louisiana Legislative Auditor's Office, who did a performance audit of Louisiana's entire systemic response to domestic violence. And that audit resulted in many findings and recommendations, but the first was this. They found that a lack of domestic violence shelter beds and support services to meet the needs of all victims is an ongoing challenge in Louisiana. And they further found that more funding, consistent funding levels, and more flexibility in how funds can be spent could help improve service delivery to victims. And this is something that was very apparent to those of us who are working in this field already, because each year we track the number of unmet requests for domestic violence shelter across the state, and each year we have an average of 2,500 unmet requests for shelter. So that is about 2,500 times that someone needed a shelter bed and could not get it in Louisiana because the beds are full, not because they didn't qualify, not because of any other reason, but because the beds were full. So that comes out to almost 7 requests per day. And it's certainly not for lack of trying. The domestic violence shelters in our state are doing really amazing work. They are working so hard. They're serving tens of thousands of survivors and their children every year. They're just under-resourced. And so they can't meet the full need. And the audit also found that unlike many other states, only 10% of the funding in Louisiana for domestic violence service providers comes from state sources, and none of that is state general fund. The state sources that the domestic violence providers receive include a little bit of justice reinvestment funding and a little bit of marriage license fees, but they receive zero state general fund dollars. So our request to the legislature is an appropriation of $3 million of state general funds to the network of domestic violence service providers so that we can fill those immediate gaps in services. Domestic violence shelters are really, really good at stretching a dollar. They've been doing it for 40+ years. And so that $3 million would be able to fund the annual operation expenses of approximately 200 additional shelter beds, which would be able to serve approximately 3,000 extra survivors every year. The goal, of course, being that any domestic violence victim who needs immediate shelter would be able to get it. So in addition to leading LCADV, I wear a second hat as the chair of the Louisiana Domestic Violence Prevention Commission, which is a commission that was created by the legislature in order to study and make recommendations regarding domestic violence in Louisiana. So I wanted to briefly highlight the commission's recommendations for this year, including first, allocate state funding to domestic violence services. They further recommend the creation of a batterer intervention program accreditation board, which would provide the oversight for the programs that provide the intervention services for people who commit domestic abuse. Those programs currently are operating without any mandatory standards of service and no oversight as to their content or their quality. Third, the commission recommends continued partnerships to implement a consistent and comprehensive definition of domestic abuse throughout the Civil Code. There are currently over 30 definitions of domestic abuse in the Civil Code, which of course leads to inconsistency and confusion. Fourth, the commission recommends that law enforcement and coroners provide full investigative reports to the National Violent Death Reporting System, which is a database that is housed in each state's Department of Health. So in our state, the data from this NVDRS forms the basis of Louisiana's domestic abuse fatality review process. And so allowing that NVDRS to receive full investigative reports would allow for a more robust review and better recommendations from this panel to prevent future domestic violence related deaths. And then finally, the commission recommends consistent training on the implementation of firearm transfer procedures, which are the protocols that each jurisdiction is required to have in place to transfer the firearms out of the hands of those who are convicted of domestic violence crimes or who are subject to certain protection orders. So quickly moving back to LCADV's legislative priorities, our approach to legislative advocacy is determined and defined by the survivors who form the core of our network. We support and bring forth legislation that does the following things. Right? So provides a comprehensive resources for victim safety. So again, we're working toward that well-funded and well-resourced safety net for survivors who are in immediate need. Ensures survivor access to justice. So this includes legislation related to criminal penalties sometimes, but more frequently is focused on ensuring that survivors have access to civil legal remedies like protection orders and things like that, and also on ensuring that survivors who are criminalized for defending themselves or who are otherwise caught up in the criminal justice system have access to appropriate relief. We also support policies that prevent domestic violence homicides. So this pertains to minimizing the known risk factors for homicide, like abusers' access to firearms, policies that isolate survivors from their support systems, policies that allow abusers to escape accountability entirely. Then we support policies to promote the economic stability of survivors. So we know, unfortunately, that there is no safety without economic security. So this priority is focused on policies that allow survivors to support themselves and their families, like paid leave, pay equity, housing access, early childhood education, those types of things. And then we support policies that promote safe environments. Our vision, of course, is a Louisiana that is free from violence, and that can only exist by changing the many, many structural issues that allow a violence to occur in the first place. So when we focus on creating safer homes and safer schools and neighborhoods and communities, then we are doing the work to truly stop violence at its source. So thank you for your time and for the opportunity to share a little about our efforts this year. And we look forward to partnering with many of you to build that safer Louisiana for our families.
Thanks so much, Mariah, for a great presentation, for sharing with us this important information, the data related to those incidences of domestic abuse that results in fatalities is just mind numbing. You know, when you think about, we're in the top 5 in terms of, you know, incidences that result in people dying. And the other thing is just the information about why this is such an issue here in our state. And you shared that we've had some basic systemic failures, most of it related to not funding this safety social net. And certainly the legislative request of some $3 million that would provide additional safeties, additional beds. It seems like that's one of the more fundamental challenges. It's just not enough beds for people who really need them. And so thanks again, Mariah, for sharing this information and educating us about things we need to do to make families safer.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll transition now into our fearless leader, my predecessor, and somebody known to everybody who's had anything to do with domestic violence, and that's the fabulous Kim Sport. Kim Sport is an attorney and past chair of the United Way of Southeast Louisiana's Public Policy Committee and the Louisiana Domestic Violence Commission. She currently chairs the United Against Domestic Violence Commission, which in cooperation with United Way of Southeast Louisiana, the New Orleans Family Justice Center. So yeah, that center is a joint effort between the commission and United Way of Southeast Louisiana, and the Louisiana Coalition Against Violence, and many other collaborative partners. So there's a number of collaborative partners that has worked with Kim, and Kim has provided leadership. They have changed over 150 provisions of law to protect victims of domestic violence, domestic abuse, and also to punish their perpetrators. Without further ado, Ms. Kim Sport.
Thank you, Ron. Very, very kind introduction. Mariah, great presentation as always. I'm a volunteer. I am not the boots on the ground type of person like Mariah, and also like Morgan, who deal directly with the victims of sexual assault, domestic violence, human trafficking, and the like. I have so much respect for all of you that do that work. I know I sort of entrenched myself in your work many years ago with Charmaine when I first became chair of the United Way's Public Policy Committee. I was motivated by, of course, what you were doing, and also by what you were unable to do. I think that it's an absolute travesty that there is no general funding from our government in Louisiana to support survivors of domestic abuse. I truly hope that that's going to change this year. I want to say something about, not so much talk about what we've accomplished, because we've accomplished a lot. Like you heard Ron say, 150 provisions of law have been changed, but those laws are not going to make a difference unless they are adequately implemented and enforced. And what we are finding, let's just start with prosecutions by district attorneys. We are finding that up to 80% of domestic abuse battery charges, even those involving strangulation, are being dismissed in some jurisdictions. We are finding that district attorneys are allowing the perpetrators of domestic abuse to plead down to a lesser offense, such as simple battery, so that none of the protections that we put in place regarding domestic abuse intervention programs and transfer of firearms, dispossession of firearms for 10 years following a conviction go into effect. And that is just, it's outrageous. And there's no reason that we should now, after having a firearm transfer law in place since I think we started in 2017, that we're still trying to get uniform procedures in place for the transfer of firearms from the perpetrators through the sheriff's office into some place where the perpetrator will not have access to those firearms. Like I said, we have the laws, but if they're not implemented, they're not going to work. We have faced a real challenge in the legislature, particularly last year, where two different special interest groups were trying to make it harder for victims of domestic abuse to obtain protective orders, to actually raise the standard of proof that they must show as far as their abuse so that they could indeed be granted a protective order. People think that protective orders in Louisiana are handed out like candy, and they are not. First of all, a victim usually applies for a temporary restraining order, and then the perpetrator is given notice of that restraining order. And only after a contradictory hearing will a protective order be issued. And a contradictory hearing means that the parties both have rights to attorneys, they have notice of the court dates, they can appear, they can both call witnesses to defend themselves or to make their cases. It's pretty hard to get a protective order, I will say, in Louisiana. But we found that one group that surprised me was the Family Forum, that was in agreement that it ought to be harder to get protective orders in Louisiana because they are such strong proponents of the preservation of marriage. And they felt that a protective order inhibits reconciliation by married couples who should be together. We faced a big fight there, but we ultimately defeated that legislation in the sense that it wasn't even brought forth in committee. The other threat, which has been more pronounced in the last 2 weeks than anything I ever imagined, was by gun rights groups in Louisiana with support from the NRA. We have a situation where truly a protective order our law now says if you have a protective order against you, you cannot possess a firearm for the duration of that protective order. It's very simple. And that's only after you have had your day in court. A person cannot go and get a protective order on their own. No one's going to be disarmed unless they have a protective order granted against them. These same gun rights groups were the proponents behind, again, making it harder for a person to get a protective order so that someone would not be disarmed during the pendency of a protective order. And I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we received a decision for the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, the United States versus Brahimi decision, which said that if you have that the federal law, which disarms abusers subject to a civil protective order, is unconstitutional. And it's based on the fact that at the time, this is the argument now, at the time that the Constitution was written, the time in the late 1700s when the Second Amendment was ratified, there were no corollary laws, there were no analogous restrictions on gun rights because you were a domestic abuser. Now, we all know that in the 1700s, it was just fine to beat your wife. It was a family matter. It was okay. Of course, you're not going to find anything there. And in my opinion, they should only have looked as far back from a historical perspective to the Lautenberg Amendment era, which is when the federal law said no firearms during the pendency of protective order and no firearms following a conviction for domestic abuse battery. The Federal Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals opinion applies in Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi. So I am assuming that the DOJ is going to take this up on appeal. It will eventually end up in the Supreme Court, who will ultimately make the decision as to whether a civil protective order can be enforced under federal law as depriving someone of a firearm. Everyone's very anxious about this. It is a problem. I want to mention just a couple of other things. I know that I'm running out of time. We have a situation in some jurisdiction in Louisiana where there's a family court and there's a criminal court and then there's a civil court, and none of the courts communicate with each other, even electronically. So something can be going on in family court where a victim is trying to get a protective order, and there could be criminal proceedings going on in the criminal district courts, but the courts do not communicate. This is nonsensical, and it's not good for the safety of the victims. We also have a situation where we're finding that ankle monitoring companies are doing a very poor job of tracking perpetrators, and that there have been instances where someone has broken through the perimeter where they're supposed to be, has actually set a victim's house on fire, has killed somebody, and that's another thing that needs to stop. But let me just end with this. We need more legal services for victims of domestic abuse in Louisiana. I talked earlier about Alice families. More than likely, an Alice family victim is not going to be able to go out and hire a private attorney. It's very, very difficult. And we need to make sure that our legal services, like Southeast Legal Services, are adequately funded also, along with all of the shelter and other services provided by the Louisiana Commission Against Domestic Violence.
Kim, thanks so much for sharing this important information. It really does make sense to think about how just because laws are passed, it doesn't mean that they're going to be enforced. And thanks, Kim, for pointing out that although there's a lot of work, about 150 sort of laws passed, or laws and policies passed, they haven't been adequately enforced. And you have to adequately enforce and implement the laws. And we've suffered because of that. And there even seems to be some retrenchment. People are kind of going back and taking away some of the gains, or attempting to take away some of the gains. And Kim, thanks so much for bringing that up, because it means that we have work to do. We have a lot more work to do. And I was one of the people who was jumping up and so happy when Kim and her team were able to kind of get some legislation in place that I never thought would happen in this state. I never thought, and so I really appreciate that in your leadership, Kim. But we have work to do, as Kim has reminded us, to ensure that those new laws are implemented, and also to look closely at protective orders and how there are groups, competing interests, I might say, like the guns rights groups and Family Forum, who have pushed back on these things that protect survivors. So thanks again, Kim, for sharing such helpful information. So I'll transition now into Morgan Lamandre. Morgan Lamandre, Esquire, is the president and CEO of STAR. Morgan has been involved with the organization since 2007, beginning as a volunteer hospital advocate and becoming a full-time staff member in 2013. Morgan has served in on various task forces to address sexual assault in Louisiana, and has drafted and testified in support of several bills that address sexual violence before the Louisiana legislature. Morgan. Thank you, Morgan.
Well, thank you for having me. It's definitely interesting and weird for me to still hear people refer to me as president and CEO. It's a very new title as of January 1st. I've been working with STAR for over 10 years now, but I was recently promoted to president and CEO. And, you know, it's exciting, but one of the new things having to really see firsthand in this position is issues related to funding. So I know Mariah kind of spoke to this about funding, and I think that's going to be a common theme you hear with all of us us who are working with survivors of interpersonal violence. But just to kind of give you a little background about STAR, STAR stands for Sexual Trauma Awareness and Response. It's a mouthful, so STAR is much easier to say. And I will say one of my favorite things, before I was in this position, I was an attorney. Well, I'm still an attorney, but I was the legal director. Whenever we'd go to court, people like judges and attorneys would refer to us as the STAR attorneys. So there was this one time when I went to court. It was for a protection order hearing, and the judge and the opposing counsel kept saying, the STAR attorney's here, the STAR attorney's here. And there was a recess, and this guy came up to me afterwards, and he's like, ma'am, can you answer a question for me, because they kept referring to you as a STAR attorney, so I figured you would know the answer to this. And that's just sort of a fun little story to hear about STAR. But what STAR does is we are a standalone nonprofit sexual assault center. We serve 15 parishes throughout central and southeast Louisiana. And when we say sexual assault, what we typically mean, because unfortunately sometimes people confuse sexual assault with domestic violence, they will refer to us as, all of us as the domestic violence advocates, or just the sexual assault advocates. Sexual assault is a form of victimization that can occur inside of a relationship where, we consider domestic abuse. Rape and sexual assault within an intimate partner relationship is one of the highest leading lethal indicators, as well as guns around. So it is something that when you do see it inside of an intimate partner relationship, it is pretty dangerous. But I will say, as far as STAR goes, most of our clients that we see and serve are in non-intimate partner settings. And that's just because typically, if you are an intimate partner survivor, you typically go to the domestic violence programs, because those needs that they have, a lot of times dealing with shelter, assistance with children, and all those domestic violence centers typically have those types of resources. Sexual assault centers, there's no requirement in accreditation for us to have a shelter, because it's not addressing that typical issue. Now, there's still times when housing is great. And what we do see is a lot of intersection where you have someone who, the mother, typically may be physically abused by her partner, and then her children were sexually abused by the partner. So there is a lot of crossover, but certainly most of the clients that we see fall into the stranger, acquaintance, other family member type of relationship. So going back to, one of the things about sexual violence and any kind of victim services in Louisiana, a lot of times you will hear legislators say, we fund this, and it's because they funded one aspect of something. Mariah referenced for domestic violence centers, I believe that there is some sort of fee associated with marriage licenses that they receive. And then at times there was justice reinvestment. For sexual assault, we have no fines or fees. We have all pass-through funding, but that is very distinctly coming from the federal government, not the state. And, a few years back, I worked with United Way. We came to the table because Louisiana was out of compliance with paying for forensic medical exams for victims of sexual assault. So we creatively came up with a way. Charmaine, I think she said, I wonder what would happen, when you leave those little slot tickets at casinos and all. What happens to that money? Well, that money does add up, and it did add up to being able to pay for forensic medical exams for survivors. Once again, though, those exams were something we were required to do as of 2005. At the latest, we were supposed to be in compliance with this law, this federal law that said we would pay for forensic medical exams. We were supposed to be compliant in 2009. So what does that mean? That means Louisiana didn't become compliant until 2015. That's sort of where Louisiana is as a state. And so we do depend a lot on the federal government passing laws, typically through the Violence Against Women Act, that says, you have to do something in order for you to continue receiving federal funding, because that's when we typically take stuff seriously. At times, I've been concerned because as more restrictions come into play and there's a desire to pass more gun restrictions on the federal level, I have concerns at times that our state will not care about the federal funding. And what would happen is victim service providers would be devastated, because that's where the majority of our funding is. It is not, any kind of, as Mariah indicated, state general funds. It's something that I hope that we can really work hard on. It's something that's still needed, and a lot of times we come together as groups. Mariah, Kim, we've worked on so many pieces of legislation that either affects, human trafficking survivors, sexual assault, domestic violence, or different, components of each type of victimization. Some of the things I'm really proud of that we've worked on, and, I swear I'm not always pregnant every time we pass these big pieces of legislation. And I'll swear Mariah is not always pregnant, but I do distinctly remember us being pregnant a lot of times, even though I'm like, I only have 3 children. She has 4, but 3 pregnancies because she had twins. But I'm like, for the material witness warrant bill that we passed that limited the ability for prosecutors to put our survivors in jail if they don't want to participate. Mariah was pregnant for that one, but we got that one passed. I think it was in 2016 we passed the essentially the Rape Survivor Child Custody Act that says, if you become pregnant as a result of rape, you can terminate the parental rights of the rapist. I was pregnant at that time. We have really revamped our Title IX, sort of our state laws related to Title IX and power-based violence. Kim, sorry, in one piece of legislation that deals with the panel, it says power-based violence. Everything else says power-based abuse. That is a good, that is one of the reasons why we should always collaborate, and hopefully not at the last minute to fix those types of things. We're doing better about that. But also we worked on some legislation last year that would allow survivors access to forensic medical exam reports as well as police reports, because a lot of times survivors are not even entitled to their own information about themselves. And what we typically say at STAR is justice comes in many forms. Justice is not always jail for survivors. And, we have really worked hard to try to steer clear of calling the criminal legal system the criminal justice system, because justice is not always there for a lot of survivors. And what we do see at times with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking is that survivors, when they engage with the criminal legal system, they can in turn become criminalized. And that's something that I'm really proud of, a coalition that we have right now. We're working on a bill that would be called the Justice for Survivors Act. And what it does is it allows for a justification defense that really highlights the coercion part of, domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual assault, to really show like the history of abuse and how somebody in the end may have, it may not be in the typical sense of self-defense, but when they've had enough and reached a certain point and they feel like somebody's coming after them, maybe they, essentially were defending themselves, but they took a life. We're working on that to be able to have the survivors that do want to protect their own life. At this point, some survivors are faced with, do I get killed or do I stand up? Well, we as a Louisiana stand your ground state are always telling them to stand up. But too often survivors, in particular survivors of color, are criminalized for defending themselves. And so that bill would allow for a justification defense. And, we're constantly working on things to make access to information better for survivors. some of the things that we're also going to be working on is tracking for sexual assault forensic exam kits. You know, if you can go online and see exactly where your Amazon package is, there's no reason not to be able to know exactly where your rape kit is. That's very important for survivors right now. And just one other thing I want to point out, so that we passed, and I see I got 3 minutes remaining, but I don't know how long that's been posted up. But we passed last year a bill that requires hospitals, if a survivor requests emergency contraception during the forensic medical exam and they have a negative pregnancy test, hospitals are required to dispense Plan B. What was great about that is there was no exception, you know, for any hospital based on religious affiliation. Now, obviously, a hospital is not religious in the sense of a personal conscience. Hospitals don't have a personal conscience, I guess you could say, but individuals are already protected if they have some sort of objection personally. But with that bill, it really was the first of its kind, I think, definitely in the South, but we have reason to believe that bill is going to be under attack this session. So we really are going to be in defense mode for that bill, because it is really the only last defense that a survivor of a sexual assault may have to prevent pregnancy as a result of rape. So that is something really important that we need to defend. It is great because it passed unanimously in both the House and the Senate last year. That is unthinkable when you think of all the people we were able to get religious groups to either stay neutral or to support it. So we were very proud of that. Unfortunately, there's been a shift in tide, you know, because of other things, and we believe that that bill is at risk. But I could go on and talk policy forever. I have many adventures with Charmaine, Kim, and Mariah, and definitely Dr. Hunter. We see her a lot at the commission meetings, and so I'm very much amongst great people and can't wait to work with them in the coming months.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Morgan, for sharing this important information, and also to reiterate the issues related to funding in this state. This state just does a terrible job at supporting people who are survivors of the many challenges that we are disproportionately impacted by in Louisiana. You know, the other piece that I think was really important for us to recognize is that although the federal government is in place kind of making some things happen in terms of resources, our state has lagged and has been really slow in compliance with even federal laws that will protect survivors. And the piece that I think, and I'll use this if you don't mind, Morgan, this whole issue of you know, how we sort of conceptualize the legal system. And we always talk about criminal justice, but is there justice, particularly for survivors? And so it's really a criminal legal system. And I think we need to continue to push to realize the criminal justice system. So thanks so much, Morgan, for sharing this information. So now I'll move to Dr. Dana Hunter, who's been with us in the past and who's done a great job leading the governor's office. So Dr. Hunter is a Baton Rouge native. She was appointed by Governor John Bell Edwards as executive director of the newly created Office of Human Trafficking Prevention. That was Senate Bill 170. It was signed into law during the 2021 legislative session. She's also the executive director of the Children's Cabinet, which is responsible for coordinating funding and programmatic services at the state and local levels. Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you, Charmaine and Michael, for having us and just for providing space to provide these important updates. And thank you to all of the presenters before me for just sharing enlightening information. And it's just an honor to serve with you all in this work. I'll share my screen. Let's see if I can do this fairly quickly. Let's see. All right. Okay, is it up there?
Yes, it's up there.
Okay, perfect. I will share with you all that we are just in a all-time crisis, a public safety crisis. The issue of domestic violence, the issue of crime and crimes of violence against women, the issue of human trafficking is happening all around us and right under our noses. And no family is exempt. I think it is just important for us to educate our children, our family members, our nieces, nephews, everyone around us about these important issues, because again, no one is exempt. And I'll share just a little bit very briefly. I know I have just a short period of time. When we talk about the Alice families and those who are at risk of human trafficking, we like to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the basic needs of food, clothing, and shelter that are so often, with the pandemic and even before the pandemic, families not having access to education and livable wage jobs. Families who do have jobs, those Alice families, families who are individuals who lack that self-esteem, who lack that basic need of safety, security, psychological support, and feeling of purpose. These families and individuals are all around us. And I will tell you that traffickers, exploiters, perpetrators of domestic violence, they are on the prowl to sniff out these women who they feel are vulnerable, who they feel needs help with their rent. Let me just put this in layman's terms, who they feel like needs assistance with maintaining a household, a single parent mother who's working 2 and 3 jobs to take care of her children. They're sniffing them out and connecting, using all sorts of manipulative tactics, false promises of love, false that Romeo pimp who says all the right things to get near that victim. Let me tell you, when I say everybody's vulnerable, all of our family members, because so many women, they want that relationship, that healthy relationship. Young girls, our college students, and these pimps and perpetrators are preying on young men and women. And so I'm just excited that there's leadership in this state who's not afraid to call it out. Kim, I love how you just said it exactly how it was, because we have to speak truth to power. We have to say, okay, we have a serious crisis here. And so I'm thankful, of course, to the leadership of our governor and first lady who has put this issue on the forefront. Being Children's Cabinet Director, I will tell you that we had several issues we were working on. Foster care, youth agent out of foster care, juvenile justice reform, mental health, all of these things. But when human trafficking came to the surface, it quickly consumed a lot of our efforts. Why? It's because human trafficking is one of those hidden, subtle crimes that's snatching young people and older adults by the droves. And I will tell you, let me go to our next slide. Our 2022 data showed us that 992 victims presented to service providers in our state for assistance. 992 presented for assistance. Several victims of human trafficking, as you know, victims of domestic violence, it takes them years sometimes before they present for help. So this is just a snapshot of what we know. 79% of the victims who presented for assistance were victims of sex trafficking. I will tell you that human sex trafficking is taking over. These perpetrators are taking these young girls and young men and forcing them to perform 13 to 15 sexual acts a day. I didn't say in a month, a day, to meet a specific quota. Human trafficking victims are given a quota of sometimes between $5,000 and $10,000 a week. And some victims have shared with us that their quota was $10,000 a night. that they had to meet and make for their pimp. So imagine 79% of these victims of sex trafficking. It's heinous, it's just unimaginable what they're experiencing. 2%, and this is something that we're now working on, 2% of the victims who presented for services were victims of labor trafficking. Our office, we're utilizing a full $1.5 million allocated to us from the U.S. Department of Justice to now unfold and uncover this issue of labor trafficking. We've spent the last 3 to 4 years educating the public, educating our service providers on how to identify sex trafficking, when all along labor trafficking, you see that number 2%, that number is much higher right here in our state. But we don't know what to look for. We don't know that victims are being bused and shipped and flown in from China, from other parts of the United States to become victims of labor trafficking. They're serving in the illicit massage business. They're forced into all sorts of construction businesses, farm businesses, for all sorts of fraudulent businesses, false promises of employment, modeling, come do this modeling gig. They are being tracked, solicited online. Perpetrators know of the language barriers, perpetrators know of the needs that we talked about before, and they are taking advantage of people in this way. I learned just even a few weeks ago that here in Louisiana, there are 162 that we know about, 162 illicit massage parlors right here in our state. We are 20th. So of course, California is #1 in the number of illicit massage, then Texas. But here in Louisiana, this issue, what we know about is there are over 162 illicit massage parlors here. What does that mean? What we know is that there are 8 or 9 victims in these massage parlors. This is labor trafficking and sometimes labor and sex trafficking. But these young women are forced to work in these illicit massage parlors all day long. They are serving sometimes more than 40 to 50 victims a day, making money for someone who's not on site, someone who's at a distance. And so again, when I tell you this issue is real, it's right here and it's right under our noses. Imagine going into one of these massage businesses, thinking I'm just here getting a professional massage, and it's being done by a victim, someone who's being forced. And someone who, when you walk out, just because you want a real professional massage, the next person walks in, know that they're a victim, and they take full advantage of them and force them into sexual activity. The victims in this industry, we said, are raped. We heard from a survivor, a labor survivor who worked in this business, who said they were raped more than 40 times a day. Raped more than 40 times a day. So again, this issue is real, and I just keep saying, and First Lady Edwards says it all the time, it's right under our nose and it's right in our own backyard. So what have we been doing over the years? I'm so thankful again to our Louisiana legislators, Ronnie Johns, Beth Mizell, Regina Barrow, and several others who are saying, look, let's put more laws on the books. And as one of our speakers said prior to me, let's not just put these laws on the books, but let's see how they're being implemented, and let's make sure they're being enforced. And so over the years, there was in 2018, Act 663 was passed to create the Buyer Beware program to increase fines for the purchase of commercial sexual activity. What are we doing about the buyers? We have to really do what we can to highlight this is not okay. Purchasing sex is not okay. The buyers really doing what we can to reduce that demand. Again, in 2021, Act 322 eliminated the prescriptive period for a civil action suit against a person for sexual abuse of minors, including human trafficking and trafficking of children for sexual purposes. Again, we also know that our office was created, Act 409 passed, and then in 2022, Act 130 was so instrumental here for our state. It allows victims to now receive criminal record relief and get the criminal acts that happened during that trafficking experience to be expunged from their record. That is just a game changer for so many victims, adult victims here in our state. And we were pleased to find out that Polaris released their 2022 criminal record relief for trafficking survivors report. And they showed that Louisiana, who was unranked in 2019, we are now ranked as 4th in the nation for offering criminal record relief for survivors. And then also one more that I will add and then just share one more minute. Act 440, which was recently, which went into effect in January, is also, I believe, a game changer to reduce the demand. It requires residents of the state to verify their age via the Louisiana Wallet app on pornography websites. It requires any online publisher whose content is more than 33.3% pornographic material to have visitors verify their ages. This is important and is intended to be a deterrent and to combat the overexposure of minors to pornography. We've heard so many times from young victims that they were first exposed or brought into the life when they were first exposed to pornography at a young age. I remember speaking with a mom who said that her 5-year-old went to school and was exposed to pornography. And so again, our office has been working diligently through the commission to address many of these issues. And we're so thankful to support the Justice for Survivors Act. We have, again, the funding to address the labor trafficking issues here in our state, and also to work with our state departments to implement Act 662. So I'll turn it over. I know that I'm at time. So thank you all so very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hunter, for sharing this information and reminding us. It's something we all know, but it's good to be reminded we're in a crisis. You know, we're in a public safety crisis, which means that we have to do something about it. And obviously, when we talk about one of the more major challenges in that public safety crisis around human trafficking, and it really, you know, kind of make me think at least about our Alice families who are particularly vulnerable. And as Dr. Hunter said, there are people out there prowling. These predators are just waiting, and they recognize the vulnerability of our families and some of the women. And as Dr. Hunter stated, although it's mostly female, there are male victims and transgender victims of human trafficking as well. And most of the human trafficking is around sex trafficking. And so there's a lot for us to do. One of the things that really, I guess made me kind of gut check and really impacted me was this whole quota thing and a large amount of unsavory acts that these victims are required to do to meet somebody else's demands who's nowhere around. And so, yeah, you have really raised the awareness, Dr. Hunter, about how important it is to do more work. You mentioned laws, and there have been some good ones that have been passed, like the Criminal Records Release Act, which is, as you mentioned, a game changer. So that's very helpful. And one thing that I will note that was a little bit surprising and pleasing to me was that we're fourth in the nation. One of the good distinctions in terms of the utilization of the criminal records relief provisions. And so thanks so much, Dr. Hunter. And now we'll have some opportunities for questions to be submitted. I think there is a question from Mary Ambrose. Is Mary on? You want to, she may not be on. Mary, yeah, can you ask your own question? And I think we may have some other questions in the chat.
Yes, Dr. Hunter, as you talked about the labor trafficking and from the employer side in the State Department of Labor, how are you working with them? And are there repercussions or anything in place to hold those employers accountable or shut them down or whatever?
Yes, thank you. So our Human Trafficking Prevention Commission, we just established a labor trafficking subcommittee. And we now have someone from the Department of Labor who's sitting on that subcommittee. We're also in the plans right now working with the University of Southern Mississippi, the Greater New Orleans Human Trafficking Task Force, and Catholic Charities of Greater New Orleans to host the state's first labor trafficking symposium to raise awareness of this issue. So stay tuned. That will be in May or June of this year. And also, our Human Trafficking Prevention Commission, we recommended legislation to really take a deep dive at our state contracts to see if there are protections in our state contracts to make sure that if we offer a state contract, that those companies who come in to do construction after a disaster or something to that effect, that they are aware of this labor trafficking issue and that they have protections for any person who worked for them.
Thanks.
Thank you. I definitely want to be made aware when that symposium happens. Definitely.
Surely.
Thank you.
All right. So Mary J., do we have any other questions in the chat?
I do not see any, but the chat is open, so we welcome your questions.
Okay. Well, if there are any questions, please ask them, but I'm going to move on to Charmaine. And Charmaine, as you're aware, is the Chief Operating Officer, Executive Vice President, and Chief sort of policy person who has really made a name for herself in United Way of Southeast Louisiana and the legislature in Baton Rouge, and also in the Beltway. She continues to be a strong advocate for public policy issues. And as we mentioned earlier, this is the way to get systemic change. We have to do policy work. And I'm so proud to be a part of Charmaine's team.
Well, thank you very much, Ron, but I would be remiss in not acknowledging that I am especially privileged. Each one of these presenters today, I feel like we're all tied at the hip at the state legislature. And the work that we do, I would remind everybody that's listening, is not just when the legislature is in session. The work that we do in policy and advocacy around these issues is a year-round commitment. And were it not for your individual commitment being made, your passion, and just the sincerity by which you try to educate, inspire, and inform individuals living throughout Louisiana how important it is to have their voices heard. You know, domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, that impacts all of our lives. And we must continue to be committed and firm in our resolve to end this violence, because I think it's fair to say at the end of the day, the need for trauma-informed care, the need for access to services, these are incredibly important contributors to that trauma-informed care that then escalates into what we are now seeing is the fact that we're seeing so much attention on just crime in general. So many people impacted by this kind of violence. That's the result of that. So we must continue to work together. And oh my God, Kim Sport, we're in the process of preparing our wonderful United Against Domestic Violence journal. And I would just like to say, for those of us who are embedded in this work, it's a real sacrifice, because whether you're like our providers here that are on the front line serving victims, Kim, when we are researching and putting a face on this issue, I don't know that there's a stronger emotional commitment that we make in doing this work, because we end up being intimately touched by those lives who their lives are sacrificed because domestic violence is so prevalent in our community. So we're going to continue to be passionate about that, and working with you is going to ensure, along with all of you, that we do everything we can to move the needle in the right direction. I'm now pleased to say that if you're joining us today, please take part in our session 4, which will include government leaders. I'm delighted to say that we've received confirmation from the governor's office, from the superintendent of education, from Secretary Phillips with the Department of Health, and with the Department of Children and Family Services. We are pending a commitment on who will be representing the Department of Corrections, but I can tell you, you're in for a treat. These individuals will share with us their department priorities for this legislative session. So I'm sure it's going to be informative and very engaging. So thank you all for being a part of today's program. Thank you for taking time on the Friday before Mardi Gras to join us. Please know that this will be shared. We will send these links out because they've been recorded. But I love you all and thank you so much for your commitment to support and engage with the United Way. We can't be effective in policy and advocacy if we do not have your expertise, your guidance, and your commitment. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks again for attending. I don't know if Michael has anything to say at the close. I always want to defer to the CEO just to see if there's any closeout from him.
No, I'll say what Charmaine said, Ron. I posted in the chat. I thought it was a fantastic session, and I especially appreciate, kind of bringing forth the context of Alice households and how when families are, and especially single parents and females are financially unstable, how vulnerable that leaves. And I love that leaves them, and then the way that we can work with employers and the workforce organizations to help address that. And I think it speaks to more broadly about the need for more inclusive and equitable economic development that helps to address that. So fantastic session, and huge shout out to Charmaine for her steadfast leadership, and Mary Johns, who's behind the scenes making these sessions possible.
And God bless Pam Allison.
Pam Allison, the glue.
All right, folks, stay safe, enjoy the Mardi Gras, and stay tuned for March 8th. We'll be back, and hopefully some of you can join us for the government leaders session.